organized crime tore through the suburbs of Chicago, leaving violence and corruption in its wake. Prominent officials were seduced by greed and power, doing whatever was necessary to protect their interests. Everyone was on the take.
FBI search
It would
warrant!
fall on the FBI to weed out the corruption and to find the killer of an innocent woman.
Willow Springs, Illinois seemed like any other quiet Midwestern community, but it was really one of the most corrupt places in the nation. This tiny village nestled just outside of Chicago was in the hip pocket of organized crime. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. It was only a matter of time before corruption led to assassination and conspiracy. To end it required a federal sting operation of astounding complexity.
The bank of a sanitary canal in a remote industrial area became the site of a gruesome crime. The killers were quick and thorough. Nearby, 2 police officers were out on night patrol. When they heard the shots fired, they became alarmed. One of the officers drove towards the canal to investigate. He found nothing as he searched the desolate area.
Hey, Chief.
Also on the scene was Willow Springs, Illinois Police Chief Michael
I
Corbett.
heard it earlier myself, and I've already checked the area, so
He too saw nothing.
I got it covered.
See you later.
The following day, a prominent local attorney called police to report that his wife was missing.
Well, Mr. Masters, we'd like to ask a few questions about your wife.
Lieutenant Howard Vanek of
anyway
the
I
Cook
can.
County Sheriff's Department and his partner
me have a
responded to the call. Attorney Alan Masters said that his wife Diane had been out the night before with colleagues and friends from a local college where she worked.
After the meeting, some of the board members would go to a bar. Maybe.
She never came home. There was no sign of her yellow
What time
Cadillac.
does the meeting usually start?
I believe it
He
starts
said he made
around
calls
7
trying to
o'clock.
locate her
It's usually
until
the same
2 in the
one,
morning,
I honestly
but
don't
finally
know.
gave up.
You know where it's located?
For the officers, the information offered little insight.
Excuse me a minute. Can you ask me questions about Diane?
Lieutenant James Keating of the Cook County Sheriff's Department joined the officers.
Yeah, by all means, you can sit down.
Sir, we were just asking Mr. Masters questions about his wife's disappearance.
He asked Masters if he could have a look around the
Be
house.
happy to. Sure. Yeah, by all
Masters
means.
agreed.
No, not at all.
He had nothing to hide.
Have a seat.
The officers continued their questioning.
Anything else you can tell us?
As far as I
Reluctantly,
know,
Masters
she
offered
maybe
some
with her
new
lover,
information.
Some professor, somebody works for the college.
He suspected that his wife Diane had been having an affair.
I have no idea
Maybe
who
the
he
two
is.
lovers
No,
had
I
run
don't-
off together.
I don't know who he is or what he looks like. I just have my suspicions.
Excuse me, guys. I think we need to wrap this up.
Lieutenant Vanek wanted to investigate further and look around the house himself.
Sir, I think we need to take another look around in here.
Husbands are always suspects when their wives
I look around.
disappear.
There's nothing
Sir,
here.
we need to look around.
It's time to
Something's
go.
missing here,
Let's
sir.
go now.
But Lieutenant Keating intervened. He
Sir,
wouldn't
procedure
allow
is
it.
2 investigators always check out the scene.
In his
I think
mind,
it's
everything
time
had
to
checked
go.
out.
Now. Let's
Sir.
go now.
Vanek was upset. He didn't know why Keating would undermine his investigation. Outside, Keating confronted Lieutenant Vanek, telling him to back off.
There's no
As far as he was concerned, Masters was not a suspect. But Vanek didn't buy it, and he let Keating know. Just as the two men were about to explode, Willow Springs Police Chief Michael Corbett arrived at the scene.
Look, easy. Come on, guys. Supposed to be on the same side. Come on, man.
Keating would have the final word.
Vanek, you're off the case. Forget it. You're off the case, man. You got that?
The question still remained, where was Diane Masters? Her disappearance grabbed the media's attention.
And Diane, if you would, please come to
She had been very active in the local community. Diane had worked hard to help open a shelter for battered women. She was also involved in local politics and sat on the board of the Moraine Valley Community
also, we'd like to
College.
present Diane with this plaque to show
She
her
did
how
not
much we
appear to
thank
have any
her for all
enemies.
the hard work and her dedication in opening this crisis center, something that is needed desperately in this community.
But investigators began uncovering other details. It was reported by Diane's friends that her husband was controlling and abusive, and that Diane was planning to file for divorce. Assistant U.S. Attorney Tom Scorza followed the case.
We were pretty certain that what had happened here was that Diane and Alan had a regular marital dispute, sort of ordinary dispute, but that it had escalated into something much worse.
Go ahead and send him in.
Scorza's investigation soon revealed that Alan Masters was more than just a bad husband. It was rumored that Alan Masters had bribed local officials and police officers to secure favorable outcomes for his clients.
How'd it go?
Very well. Very well. Nothing to worry
This
about at
corruption
all.
extended right to the top of law enforcement. Allegedly, Masters frequently enlisted the help of Chief Corbett.
If I don't hear about this anymore, it'll be worth every penny.
It was also rumored that Masters and Chief Corbett were involved in safeguarding some of the Chicago mob's betting and prostitution rings, which were run out of show clubs throughout suburban Cook County. But investigators were focused only on Diane's disappearance. With no evidence and few leads, that investigation stalled. Unaware of Alan Masters or his wife's disappearance, the FBI had already begun an independent investigation into the mob-controlled rackets of the Chicago area. U.S. Attorney David Stetler worked with the FBI to help unravel the prostitution operation.
Okay, thanks. At that time, there were a number of topless, bottomless joints that one could go to, and many of them were undercover fronts for prostitution. So you could go in, you could watch the naked girls dancing on the stage, and for a price, you could retreat to the back, either to a booth or a back room, and engage in one form of sexual activity or another with the dancers.
The club owners knew that their customers would spend more on drinks and prostitutes if they could use their credit cards. But the patrons were reluctant. They did not want bills arriving at their homes or businesses with charges incurred from nightclubs with seedy names. The club owners found credit card transaction companies that were willing to process the charges using false but respectable business names. Special Agent Ivan Harris of the FBI's Chicago field office was assigned to help bring down the illegal businesses.
The scam was using various companies in order to launder credit cards through their business to make it appear that businessmen were actually eating at a restaurant or using a limousine service to incur the charges, when in fact they were charges for prostitution.
Larry Wright was one of the credit card transaction company owners. Wright would pick up the week's transactions from the clubs and process them through his company, National Credit Service, or NCS.
really working well.
One of his clients was a club owner named Joseph Marin, whose club was a front for a mob-controlled prostitution house. Wright wanted to expand his own operations. He approached Marin about setting up an illegal betting club.
Yeah, she's nice. We had a chance to really interview her.
Marin was willing to help out the man who made him money.
Yeah, she's still here. She answers to the group.
Wright would first need to pay protection money to local police in order not to be exposed and arrested.
You feel pretty confident, Bill?
Marin was the man who could arrange that protection. Wright was more than willing to pay.
All right.
Marin arranged the meeting at the Willow Springs Police Department.
I trust him completely.
It was to take place with Police Chief Michael Corbett. It was believed that Corbett had been handpicked by the Chicago mob boss to oversee and protect their interests in and around Willow Springs.
The word on the street, of course, was that no one could do anything in Willow Springs without the permission of the Chief of Police, Mike Corbett. The message also was, from virtually anyone you would talk to, that he was so powerful, that he was so well connected, that nothing could ever be done about him.
I just want to make sure I don't get any unexpected visits.
Corbett agreed to help Larry Wright set up the new betting operation for a price.
Not quite yet.
In return, Corbett assured him he wouldn't get any heat from his officers.
All right.
Larry Wright was well on his way. He returned to his office at National Credit Service, operated out of a nondescript office park location. Wright worked with two other staff members.
Doing great. Larry, great.
But these were not ordinary employees. NCS was not just a credit card transaction service for illegal activities. It was a front for the FBI. Larry Wright was actually undercover special agent Larry Damron. And he and the FBI were using NCS to work their way into the heart of the corruption in Willow Springs. While local investigators struggled to unravel the disappearance of a prominent attorney's wife, the FBI had set up an undercover operation in the town of Willow Springs, just outside of Chicago. Their target, organized crime, and the corrupt police who protected them from prosecution. The undercover work was often painstaking and frustrating. FBI Special Agent Larry Damron explains the difficulties inherent in undercover work.
During the course of the undercover operation, you try to immerse yourself in what you're doing, and you try to assume that role because it's necessary for you to do that in order to accomplish anything. Oftentimes you'll hear people make comments, or you'll see people do things that in any other circumstance they would be arrested for immediately. And so what you have to remember is you're in a role and you play that role out.
Damron had heard stories about how the mob resolved problems. They were swift and violent, and their signature was unmistakable. 2 bullets in the head. There was no room for mistakes. Victor Spilatro, a player in Chicago's organized crime, approached Damron at NCS. Though Victor himself wielded little power, his brothers held tremendous influence within the mob's hierarchy. Damron was starting to move into the center of the violent Chicago underworld.
The Spilatros were one of the best-known names of mobsters in Chicago. The older brother, Tony, was the boss in Las Vegas. He represented the Chicago outfit for their interests in Las Vegas. Had been a prominent figure and had been widely mentioned in the papers, having been involved in murders and extortions and things like that.
Agent Damron quickly developed a reputation as an effective businessman in laundering money for mob operations.
Well, we got everything back here that you need. All right, you come on back.
Sure everything's all right?
Spilatro knew of NCS's activities with the local nightclubs. They were under his control.
Really appreciate what you're doing for us.
Good, everything's going good with the business?
Yes, it's going great.
Well, that's great. Good.
He told Damron he would have to pay him a cut to stay in business.
I'm glad you appreciate what we do for you. Okay, well, that's really good.
Damron had no objection.
The level that we had there is we were paying protection to a fairly important aspect of the mob, the Spilatro family. And so that gave us a little bit of status, if you will. But we had absolutely no authority or anything like that in the mob. We were just workers, and our value was we made them money.
Agent Damron traveled to a remote hotel where he met with FBI Special Agent Gordon Brooks, who oversaw the undercover operation. To ensure that Damron's real identity was not compromised, the two met infrequently to exchange information. Brooks vigilantly kept tabs on Damron. The investigation was as dangerous as it was complex.
Not to worry about things.
The agent cautiously moved forward. He wanted to continue expanding the FBI's undercover operations. He used every opportunity he could to sell the idea of opening more betting and prostitution houses throughout suburban Chicago. Even with a go-ahead from the Spilatros, Damron would still need permission and protection from the police.
The future.
He met with nightclub owner Joseph Marin to hash out the details of the new clubs and secure police protection.
Larry, how you doing?
But there was a problem.
Look, I got some upsetting news.
What's up?
Their protector, Chief Corbett, had been removed by the Willow Springs City Council under suspicion of corruption. Marin knew another high-ranking law enforcement official who could provide the same protection as Corbett. Lieutenant James Keating, Cook County's Vice Squad Supervisor.
Tell you what, he deals with me.
U.S. Attorney Tom Scorza was not surprised by the development. Keating's reputation was well known.
Okay, you feel pretty confident about this guy?
Jim Keating was a lieutenant in the Cook County Sheriff's Police Department, but if anything, the rank understated his influence. He was a very well-connected officer in a very corrupt department. He had connections with people of higher rank who were also corrupt, and so he was a key figure.
With Corbett out of the picture, the FBI shifted their focus to Keating. Damron met with him at a restaurant outside of Willow Springs.
It allows me to really concentrate on my job.
Keating said he'd have no problem helping Damron expand his operations.
One thing we need to understand is if there's a situation that comes up.
But any move Damron made would have to be approved by him.
I make the decision when something goes down.
He warned Damron to play it straight with him and his people.
He told us that the one thing that he wouldn't tolerate was if someone double-crossed him. And he said if that happened, that they'd find us with our legs on one of the streets in the area and our head on another street in the area.
As instructed by the FBI, Damron proposed another operation. A club that would be a front for prostitution.
You're going to hold on to this.
He gave the lieutenant the first of many payments to ensure police protection.
Looks like a bonus for the guys, huh?
Before he left, Keating said he knew someone who might be able to help him. A lawyer named Alan Masters. Though he had no direct dealings with Alan Masters, Damron had heard the name mentioned by Chief Corbett.
Well, I knew that Masters was a well-known attorney on the south side of Chicago, that he had a tremendous reputation for being able to get things done, particularly in the local court system, and the scuttlebutt was that he wasn't reluctant to pay bribes or to deal with people however he needed to.
Damron continued his meetings with his case supervisor, Special Agent Gordon Brooks. Damron needed to know everything he could about Alan Masters and his relationship with Keating and Corbett.
Now, you're in with Corbett. He's dirty.
The FBI and U.S. attorneys quickly established a hierarchy within this ring of corruption.
Okay, you're making your way up to Keating? Right. I want you to...
Corbett was the king in Willow Springs, but anytime he had to do something that involved the broader Cook County, he needed to get the permission of Keating. And Keating always had to check with the ultimate fixer, Alan Masters, to make sure everything could be handled at the court level.
I can maybe get Masters interested.
As the extent of Alan Masters' criminal activity became clearer, the FBI began looking closer at his possible role in his wife's disappearance. The two distinct cases were beginning to overlap, and Damron's objectives were broadening.
Authorities call 3 counties still.
He was a suspect in the disappearance of his wife. It was thought that if we could develop a relationship with him, there might be something there that would come to light and might be of some benefit to that investigation.
Damron learned that Alan Masters allegedly made payoffs to several area judges in exchange for favorable decisions.
Now, we need to have that hearing on the Sanderson case. It needs to go our way. Do we have an understanding on that, Judge?
Agents speculated that Diane might have witnessed her husband's illegal activity and threatened to expose him.
I think we can come to terms with that. Right this way, sir.
Now trying to elicit information about Diane's disappearance, Damron continued his efforts to make inroads into the corruption around Willow Springs. He met with Keating several weeks later to follow up on his plan to open a show club.
A good manager lined up.
Oh, I've got
Again, Keating mentioned that his friend Alan Masters could help.
Can take care of that. He's a real fixer.
Damron took the opportunity to bring up Alan's wife. Keating said little, but then added an unusual comment.
The same plan we had with the other one.
Probably heard him, seen him.
We talked about Masters' wife turning up missing, and Keating said, well, she turned up missing like the day before the divorce was going to be filed.
That was convenient, wasn't it?
It was convenient.
And chuckled about what a good circumstance that was.
Damron was cautious not to probe too far, fearing that Keating might grow suspicious.
You've known this fella for a long time?
Yeah.
You've known him for a while. I've worked with him before.
Sure, he can do.
As the meeting ended, Keating handed over Alan Masters' phone number, saying the lawyer was expecting his
You
call.
won't be implicated.
I just need them each lined up. I'm going with the same.
He proceeded to set up the meeting with Alan Masters.
Hello?
Mr. Masters, how are you? This is Larry Wright speaking.
The attorney agreed to help push through all the necessary permits and legal documents, which meant bribing officials and securing protection.
Yeah, we've been working pretty hard on it for a while now.
Well, soon I think it'd be a pretty
Masters
good
suggested
location.
they get together.
Talking about,
The meeting was set for the following week, Monday, December 13th.
Okay, I'll look forward to meeting you then. I think we can maybe do some business.
Okay, thanks.
Bye.
Before the meeting would take place, however, a police officer on routine patrol near the sanitary canal area in Willow Springs noticed something unusual. Tire tracks led directly into the canal. He immediately called for assistance. Little did he know that the lid was about to come off the underworld in Willow Springs.
Find these trucks out here and mark.
While the FBI continued their undercover operation in the Chicago suburb of Willow Springs, an officer out on routine patrol made an alarming discovery. Tire tracks leading directly into the sanitary canal. Police officers and a dive team responded to the site. Overseeing the investigation was James Ross, an honest cop appointed by City Council to replace Michael Corbett as the police chief in Willow Springs. Though Corbett had been ousted from the department, his legacy of corruption remained. Below the surface, divers found a virtual underwater parking lot. 82 cars lined the bottom of the polluted canal. U.S. Attorney Tom Scorza believed he knew why the cars were there. And who could make a profit by allowing them to be dumped without a police investigation?
Those are known as insurance give-ups, people who want to collect money on their car when the car is not worth very much anymore will find a way of losing the car and then reporting it stolen and collect the insurance. My belief was that Corbett had been the approver of all of the dumping of the cars in the Willow Springs Canal.
By nighttime, a third car had been dredged up, a yellow Cadillac. The license plate on the vehicle, DGM-19, was well known in Willow Springs. It was the tag registered to Diane Masters. Lieutenant Keating of the Cook County Sheriff's Department arrived at the scene. Chief Ross was surprised that Keating, a vice cop, had been notified. He asked Keating why he was there. Keating had no response. Officers continued examining the Cadillac. When they pried open the trunk, they discovered a decomposed body. Ross immediately ordered that the car and the body be taken back to a city garage where they could be thoroughly examined for clues. The decision not to use the police garage was well reasoned. Chief Ross knew this case potentially had far-reaching implications, and he couldn't trust his own officers. The fewer people nosing around, the better. State police began to scour the car and the body for evidence. They found .22 caliber shell casings in the trunk. The keys were still in the ignition. Eerily, the watch on the deceased body and the dashboard clock had stopped at exactly the same time, 1:50. They removed the body for further forensic investigation. The forensic team examining the body found the skull had been crushed. They also discovered 2 bullet hole entries in the left cheekbone. The bullet fragments inside the skull were removed and sent off to the FBI lab for ballistic evaluation. Dental records confirmed what everyone believed. The body found in the trunk was Diane Masters. The 9-month investigation into Diane's disappearance was now a homicide investigation.
Come on in.
Chief Ross called in Cook County Detective John Reed to work the homicide. He was to team up with the FBI, who was now taking over the murder investigation. Detective Reed was not to trust even his closest friends in the department. He was told that through the FBI undercover operation run out of NCS, law enforcement officers were being investigated for corruption. And some had ties to Alan Masters, who was now a firm suspect in Diane's murder. As Agent Harris and Detective Reed initiated their murder investigation, Agent Damron continued his undercover operation.
Today to set up a time and place for our meeting.
He called Alan Masters to confirm their meeting to set up the show club.
I'm jammed. I expect to be in court all day tomorrow. I'm sorry.
Well,
Masters was evasive and
next
seemed
week's
distracted.
Okay too, if that's okay with you.
Maybe we can work something out then. Just give me some time.
He canceled the meeting.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Wright.
Damron immediately called Keating. With the conversation being recorded by the FBI, he hoped Keating would explain why Masters was being evasive.
No, I was wondering if you had any information on that.
As I said, he's pretty busy. How about if you give me a call in 3 or 4 weeks?
But Keating was cryptic.
Maybe we can work something out then.
He instructed Damron not to bother Masters. He had too many problems to deal with.
Okay, bye.
the new show club would have to wait.
What do you got for me? Here are the transcripts.
Damron met with Agent Brooks. Masters and Keating both appeared nervous since Diane's body had been discovered. But that was hardly enough evidence to prosecute either of them for murder. Perhaps Damron had overlooked something. He handed over his tape-recorded conversations with Keating.
This is gonna nail him. We're gonna get him.
Can you play that again, please?
Over the next several months, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Cook County Sheriff's Department, and the FBI began the process of merging the various investigations.
All right. Well,
The link between them was Alan Masters, Cook County Lieutenant James Keating, and former Willow Springs Police Chief Michael Corbett.
If that's the case, if we can
It would fall on prosecutors to begin constructing a case proving that the three men and all of their activities represented an ongoing, organized criminal enterprise.
All right. We can get the RICO prosecution happening.
And what we had to do in order to prosecute Masters and Corbett and Keating for a collection of their activities, including the homicide, we had to show that they made up a criminal organization, a mini-mafia.
Appreciate you meeting with us tonight, Mrs. Capstaff.
Well, if you guys don't
Detective Reed and Agent Harris's first step was to question Diane's friends who had been with her on the night she disappeared.
Okay.
You said that you followed her home that night.
One of Diane's colleagues, Genevieve Capstaff, had actually followed Diane home that evening after a board meeting.
And so I just wanted to see, so I followed her.
Capstaff claimed everyone on the Moraine Community College Board who worked with Diane suspected that she was having an affair with an economics professor. She admitted that she wanted to see if the two were going to rendezvous. She followed Diane to her street. When Diane turned to go home, Capstaff continued on.
Is there anything else that you can tell me?
Further
that
questioning
might-
revealed that all of the community college board members, including Diane, were given a $100,000 life insurance policy as part of their employment benefits.
$100,000.
Right, yes, but that only covers...
The policy specifically stated that proceeds would be paid if a board member died while traveling to and from board meetings. The policy was void when the board member entered their home.
That's all, but...
We appreciate your
Alan Masters claimed Diane never arrived home that night. He was therefore eligible to collect the insurance money. Several months before Diane's body was discovered in the trunk of her car, Masters filed a claim with the insurance company. After filling out all the paperwork, he sent it off. Though Diane's fate at that time was unclear, Masters had a judge declare her legally dead. As a result, he was about to receive $100,000. Alan Masters was fast becoming the FBI's prime suspect in the murder of his wife, Diane. Shortly after her body was discovered, investigators learned that he had filed a claim with his wife's insurance company. Within a few months, 2 checks appeared in the amount of $50,000 each. If federal agents and prosecutors could prove Masters was responsible for his wife's death and that he profited from it, it would be one more element that showed that he and his accomplices were involved in an ongoing criminal enterprise. Homicide in a federal racketeering case carries much more jail time than a state charge. As the investigation began to take on a clearer focus, FBI agents working the undercover case received bad news.
Listen, we're gonna have to move rather quickly on this.
The Washington Post had gotten word of the operation.
Listen, we're having a bit of a problem.
We're almost at the point where we can really make some impact.
The Post gave the FBI 3 weeks to wrap it up before running the story.
We have some have to be closed down. Is that right?
Yeah, something like that.
All 16.
Agents had no choice but to quickly bring their undercover operations to a close.
Here, so please do me a favor.
For U.S. Attorney David Stetler, the timing couldn't have been better.
All right.
The project had run its course, and the bulk of the information anybody was ever going to get had been retrieved, and to make the operation go on longer would have resulted in additional evidence, but it also would have resulted in the evidence that had been gathered becoming more and more stale.
Agents had meticulously pieced together the web of corruption that extended to the nightclubs under mob control. Now it was time to shut them down.
Yo, FBI, open the door. Open the door.
The FBI hit all of the clubs on the same night with massive force. Several hundred officers and agents raided over a dozen clubs throughout Cook County, including those in Willow Springs.
Stay right here. Go on in, Pro. Stay right here.
Sit tight.
We haven't done anything.
All right, hands behind your back.
This ain't helping anything. Shut up.
Inside the clubs, federal agents were able to collect volumes of incriminating evidence. "55 people were indicted, including club owner Joseph Marin, Tony Spilatro, and his brother Victor. They were prosecuted in both the state and federal courts for extortion, prostitution, bribery, and racketeering. Several deputies from the Cook County Sheriff's Department and officers from the Willow Springs Police Department were also indicted and convicted for protecting these businesses.
Move a little faster.
After 3 years of undercover work, the sting operation was now officially closed.
What's your friend's name?
For undercover Special Agent Larry Damron, it was finally time to leave the role of Larry Wright.
I would say the finish was elation and disappointment at the same time. Disappointment that there were so many opportunities out there to identify other criminal activity. We knew that it was a good job, that we had gathered tremendous amounts of evidence, and that we had a real insight into some of the criminal activity that was taking place that we hadn't had before.
Alan Masters.
Local authorities, the FBI, and prosecutors could now focus exclusively on the Diane Masters murder investigation.
She said he hit her.
They continued questioning her friends and associates, including the man with whom she was allegedly having an affair.
There were other things that happened.
Economics professor Jim Koselniak. He confirmed that he and Diane had a relationship. He also claimed that Masters had abused Diane physically, mentally, and emotionally. She lived in fear of her husband. Diane had told him she planned to file for divorce. Koselniak also had reason to fear Alan Masters. One night, Koselniak and Diane had met for drinks at a local bar. He recalled that Diane called home to check on her daughter. Instead of getting the babysitter on the phone, Alan unexpectedly answered.
Alan?
He suspected she was with her lover.
I didn't know you were
He
in
was
trouble.
irate and began to
I
threaten
was
her.
calling to check on Andra.
He vowed to destroy her. Koselniak said Diane returned from the phone call and was very upset. He went to the bar for more drinks. There, a man suddenly confronted him and began firing off a series of questions.
Yes, I did.
The man never identified himself.
10, 12 years.
What's your name?
He asked Koselniak's name and where he worked.
Koselniak.
Koselniak.
Though the man said little else, Koselniak felt he had just received a threat. Stay away from Diane.
And
Koselniak would later recognize the man as Lieutenant James Keating.
He didn't tell you that.
restaurant.
He said that on the night of Diane's disappearance, she had called him and warned him not to meet her for drinks.
Again, different.
So this was an unusual move on her part.
They usually got together after her college board meetings.
What was the tone of voice?
Lately, she had been troubled by Alan's behavior.
That they were going to another restaurant.
Selniak
which
took her
was,
advice
again,
and canceled their
They always
plans.
met at the same place.
He never saw Diane
The
again.
meeting was always straight to RDG.
As a matter of fact, they're on the way now.
Agent Harris and Detective Reed continued to develop witnesses.
Hey, glad you could come by.
They discovered that Masters had hired a private investigator to keep tabs on Diane.
That his wife Diane.
We subsequently developed a cooperating individual named Ted Nakaza, who was a private investigator with Alan Masters. Masters had requested Ted Nakaza to place a bug on his home telephone number because he suspected his wife Diane was having an affair.
I got a few tapes.
Hey, what do you guys got for me?
Nakaza told investigators the bug was successful in exposing Diane and Koselniak's affair.
Good news.
Ted Nikaza played back a telephone conversation, captured on tape, where Diane was talking in a highly sexual way with the boyfriend, Jim Koselniak. According to Nikaza, after playing the tape, Alan Masters declared his intention to kill Diane and to get Keating to make it look like an accident.
Alan Masters wanted his wife murdered, and he had the resources to get away with it.
You gotta stay cool.
The FBI and local authorities continued to uncover evidence against Alan Masters and his associates that pointed towards a conspiracy to murder Alan's wife, Diane. Through a private investigator hired by Alan Masters, Diane's affair had been exposed.
His wife was cheating.
Alan's rage
Masters
was
had
out
all
of
the
control.
tapes. Yes.
But investigators had no hard evidence to charge him with murder. After an exhaustive 5-year investigation, that was about to change.
He intended to have Diane killed.
They uncovered a Cook County Sheriff's deputy who was willing to talk.
Agent Harris.
Deputy Jack Bachman had startling information.
Keating brought me into his
Bachman
office.
had been too afraid of the consequences of coming forward on his own.
Say any more?
He claimed that he had been approached to kill Diane. The offer had come through Lieutenant James Keating.
Bachman had a series of conversations with Keating, and ultimately Keating asked Bachman if Bachman would be interested in the job of actually stalking and killing Diane Masters.
Bachman said Keating offered him $25,000 to carry out the hit.
And,
Michael Corbett, the chief of police, had already agreed to dispose of the body. Bachman declined the offer.
No, sir, I'm sorry. I can't get involved in anything like that. No, no, sir.
Through Keating, Masters had clearly solicited a
straight
murder.
about this meeting we just had, and
Well, no, but he did offer me $25,000.
This was one of the final pieces prosecutor Scorza needed to bring an indictment.
He said he wanted to eliminate her. I said, what do you mean by
What we were able to show is that when Alan Masters decided to kill his wife, he simply was able to turn to the two police officers that he'd already been working with on corrupt activities and criminal activities. And that made the homicide and the planning of it and the solicitation of it, it made it an activity of the criminal enterprise.
The pieces had finally come together.
And Diane Masters.
Investigators put together a likely scenario of Diane Masters' murder.
She said she heard something.
Alan Masters had found a hitman to kill Diane and her boyfriend when they met for the usual drinks after her college board meeting. However, Diane didn't meet with Koselniak that evening.
You're home late tonight.
Meeting ran late.
Furious, Masters took matters into his own hands.
Alan Masters was at home babysitting their young daughter. He was setting up his alibi by making long-distance calls all night to prove that he was home. He never expected his wife to walk in the door. She did. She began the process of getting undressed, and he hit her with a blunt instrument, 2 blows to the head.
Masters then called Chief Corbett, who came with an unknown accomplice to dispose of the body. They dumped Diane's body in the trunk of her Cadillac. Corbett then drove away with the accomplice following him. Masters remained at home with his daughter. They drove to the remote sanitary canal. Diane's watch was reset to throw investigators off the trail should her body ever be found. They then fired 2 shots into her head. They wanted it to look like a mob hit. They also reset the dashboard clock to 1:50. Alan Masters made sure that he was on the phone at the time to corroborate his alibi. Corbett and the accomplice dumped the Cadillac into the canal. In June of 1988, 6 years after Diane's murder, investigators brought charges against the 3 conspirators. Former police chief Michael Corbett was the first arrested on federal charges of racketeering, bribery, and conspiracy to solicit and cover up the murder of Diane Masters. Special Agent Ivan Harris tried to elicit a confession.
Mike Corbett subsequently confessed that he was in fact the person that had put Diane Masters' car in the canal. He disavowed any knowledge, knowing that she was in the trunk of the car at that time.
Cook County Lieutenant James Keating was arrested next on the same federal charges. He too denied involvement in Diane's murder. And finally, Alan Masters. In addition to racketeering and bribery, the indictment against Alan Masters charged that he planned, solicited, and aided and abetted the murder of his wife.
If you wish one.
Prosecutors would not have enough hard evidence to charge any of the conspirators with the actual murder of Diane. Prosecutor Tom Scorza was able to successfully tie all of their criminal activities together for the jury. Masters was convicted on all counts. Collecting the $100,000 insurance money after having his wife murdered also made him guilty of mail fraud. He received a total of 40 years, effectively to the end of his life. Former Chief Michael Corbett received 20 years. James Keating was convicted and sentenced to over 30 years.
The Masters case was special in my experience because there was no one single piece of evidence proving guilt. What there were 1,000 little pieces that made a mosaic. That was made the case intriguing. It made it very difficult to present. It made it a challenge to present to the jury, but it made a terrific story because in the end the jury could see how one little piece from over here and one little piece from over there made a picture, and the picture was a plot among 3 fellows who had been involved in a lot of criminal activity to do their ultimate criminal act, murder Diane Masters.
Watch yourself.
The undercover investigation that Agent Damron oversaw, and the work of several other FBI agents, exposed a deeply rooted corruption throughout Cook County and brought it to its ultimate demise. By weeding out these pockets of corruption, the people living in the suburbs of Chicago no longer have to live with the lawlessness that threatened to destroy their community. Across the country, young men were being shot down in cold blood. The killer struck unexpectedly. His attacks were unprovoked. His sole motivation was racial hatred. And after he killed, he vanished.
When a sniper in Utah started targeting African American men for death, authorities launched a massive investigation. With scant clues and no witnesses, they found the odds stacked against them. And they had no idea where the killer would strike next. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. Civil rights violations fall under federal jurisdiction, so the killings become the FBI's business. The investigation soon grew into a nationwide manhunt for a roving serial killer.
Salt Lake City, Utah. On an August night in 1980, 4 youths walked through Liberty Park enjoying the last days of their summer. 20-year-old Ted Fields and 18-year-old David Martin had just finished choir practice. Terry Elrod had just begun dating David a few weeks earlier and had set up her friend Karma Ingersoll with Ted. This was their first date. The four had met to jog in the park, but decided to walk and talk instead. They were too preoccupied with each other to notice a man watching them through the scope of his rifle. When David Martin dropped to his knees, the others thought he was joking. Then Terry felt something sting her arm, and she knew he was deadly serious. Ted told the girls to take cover while he tried to help his friend. Then he too was shot down. Police and rescue units raced to the scene. David Martin, barely alive, was rushed to the hospital, but died hours later of 3 gunshot wounds. Ted Fields, the son of a police chaplain, was dead. Witnesses told police they heard shots coming from an abandoned building across the street. But no one saw the shots fired, and no one saw the gunman. Detectives spoke with Terry Elrod at the nearby trauma center where she was being treated for her wound. She was still badly shaken, but told investigators what she could recall. When she and her friends reached the intersection, she thought she heard firecrackers. David crumpled and she felt a sting on her arm. She saw blood, then realized that David was seriously wounded. As she told her story, she recalled something that had happened a few minutes before the shooting. The group was almost hit by a car traveling the wrong way down a one-way street. But she could not identify the make, model, or license plate, and she never saw the driver. Salt Lake City Detective Don Bell didn't know why the youths were targeted.
These were young boys. They'd never been in trouble with the police. We didn't have an outstanding motive. We didn't know whether it was something related to the girls, whether something related to the boys, or just a case of mistaken identity.
In the morning, police returned to the crime scene to conduct a more thorough search. In a field across from the park, police found tire tracks. Technicians photographed and measured them. Close to the tracks, police recovered 6 bullet casings. Witnesses said they had heard the gunfire coming from the abandoned building. Now detectives believed that what they heard were the echoes. The shooter had apparently hidden in the bushes, lying in wait for the foursome to walk into range. Police matched the casings to the bullets that killed the two young men. They sent the evidence to the FBI ballistics lab in Washington, D.C. to determine the type of gun the assassin used. That would take time. Investigators tried to find other leads to the killer's identity. Bell started with the family members of the victims. In particular, Terry Elrod's father seemed like a possible suspect.
You looking for me?
Teach Elrod led an outlaw biker gang and was upset that Terry was dating a black man. Detectives spent 3 days tracking him down.
So where have you been?
Hanging out.
When they found him, he agreed to come in for questioning. Investigators were very thorough with him. He said he'd been on a whitewater rafting trip and that friends could back up his story.
What? I did?
Just have
I
a
did?
seat. Just have a
What
seat.
am I, under arrest or something?
Detectives weren't convinced. They demanded Elrod take a polygraph test.
Find out right now. Have a seat.
He would pass, and his alibi was corroborated. Police had no more suspects. They returned to the Liberty Park crime scene to canvass the neighborhood. One resident, Gary Spicer, told investigators he had seen something suspicious earlier that evening. A car had parked close to his home, and he went out to investigate.
Hey, yo, buddy.
He saw a man packing
Yo, man,
or
what are you doing
unpacking
here?
something in the trunk.
What are you doing? What are you doing in my neighborhood?
Spicer asked what he was doing, but the stranger simply shut the trunk and drove away. Spicer didn't see his face, but told investigators that he was a slender white man. He described the car as a Camaro with chrome mags.
Yeah.
Detectives thought the information was promising, since the car was parked close to where they had earlier found the tire tracks. Two days after the murders, police seemed no closer to solving it. Press coverage intensified and community outrage escalated.
We'd never had a homicide like this in Salt Lake City. We had never had people just gunned down, especially young people gunned down in the middle of an intersection. The general public wanted to know about the killings. They wanted to know if they were race-related.
With the possibility of civil rights violations, concern grew in the Justice Department. Assistant U.S. Attorney Steve Snar was brought in to monitor the case.
Members of the black community were particularly concerned and were somewhat vocal about whether this was racially motivated, but at the time there were no clear answers.
FBI Special Agent Curtis Jensen from the Salt Lake City office was assigned to assist local investigators.
When I first heard about this case, I was incensed. It caused a great deal of concern among not just the black community, but all of the community in Salt Lake City. They felt that there was an assassin loose and it could happen again.
As community pressure grew, test results from the FBI ballistics lab in Washington, D.C. offered investigators a fresh lead. Examiners determined that the weapon had been a 6-shot rifle, either a Marlin or Glenfield .30-30. After searching gun shops and classified ads for recent purchases, investigators assembled 150 weapons that matched the description. They tested each one. None had fired the bullets found at the scene. By now, it was likely that the assailant had fled the area and perhaps the state. So the FBI sent out nationwide teletypes to local and federal agencies describing details of the crime, including the weapon and shell casings. With still no suspects, a $50,000 reward was offered to promote the public's help. Calls flooded in. All were checked, none panned out. Most who came forward were after the money and had nothing solid to offer. But one showed a hint of promise. A young woman claimed she might have met the killer. She identified herself as Mickey, a part-time prostitute. She was reluctant to talk to police until Detective Bell assured her she wouldn't be charged if she came in for an interview.
She was actually a struggling college student, and so she would go out 2 days a week and work on one of the streets that a lot of the prostitutes worked on.
She told the detective about a man she had met sometime in August, close to the time of the killings. Mickey was walking down the street when a man in a Camaro pulled up and asked if she wanted to party. She hadn't planned on turning any tricks that day, so she said no. He said he'd make it worth her while. She relented since she needed the money and the man didn't seem threatening. He spoke with a southern accent and introduced himself as Bill Hagman. He drove her to the Regal Inn Motel.
Just get ready to go.
In the room, Mickey noticed that Hagman had weapons. She described 2 long guns that stood in the corner and 1 silver handgun. Hagman didn't talk about them, and Mickey was afraid to ask. She also said that the man had tattoos on both arms. On his left forearm was an American eagle, on the right, the Grim Reaper. After their stay at the motel, Hagman offered to treat her to lunch, then drive her home. At an intersection on the way to the restaurant, he pulled out his handgun and said something she would never forget.
What's with this guy?
He explained that he was a contract hitman for the Ku Klux Klan and said, "Do you want me to kill those niggers?" She says, "Put the gun away." She was very concerned about what he was going to do. He then says, "It's real easy. I've done work like this before. You just walk up, you shoot them, you walk on. Everybody's concerned with them falling. No one pays any attention to you."
Mickey was terrified, but was able to talk him out of killing the pedestrian. Afterward, Hagman dropped her at her apartment, where he briefly met her roommate. Bell wondered if Mickey was reliable, or just another false witness looking for the reward money. Even if her story was true, Hagman's role in the case was unclear.
Did it have anything to do with our killing, or was this just a bad guy that was blowing through town and trying to, make this part-time hooker be impressed with his ability of being a hitman or something?
If Mickey could identify the long guns she saw in the motel room, her story would have more weight, especially if she identified them as either a Glenfield or Marlin rifle, which the FBI had determined to be the murder weapon. Mickey told Bell she didn't know much about firearms and didn't look at the weapons for very long.
All right, if I had to pick,
The detective insisted she try. But the guns she chose from the photos didn't match either murder weapon. Mickey's story seemed like another dead end. Despite his doubts, Bell made an appointment for her and her roommate to come back and work with a police sketch artist. Meanwhile, investigators continued to pursue the hundreds of leads that poured in. Public pressure was mounting. The community feared that the sniper could strike again, and police didn't know that he already had. Three weeks after the double murder of 2 young black men in Salt Lake City, the killer's identity remained unknown. Then the investigation took an unexpected turn. Local authorities received a response to the national telex sent by the FBI. Police in Cincinnati were investigating a similar unsolved double murder that happened 2 months earlier. On a late evening in June 1980, 13-year-old Dante Brown, and 14-year-old Darrell Lane walked to the candy store close to their homes. They never saw the man watching them. Danger struck quickly. They didn't have a chance. Cincinnati police raced to the scene. They found Darrell Lane dead. Dante was still alive, but in serious condition. Both boys had been shot twice.
Just got here, just tied it off.
Officers talked to onlookers, hoping someone had seen something, but no one had. Detective Mike O'Brien of the Cincinnati Police recalls that the coroner provided investigators with their first clue.
The coroner responded to the scene, and he had already performed a post-mortem examination on one of the young men and was able to tell the trajectory and the direction the shots were fired in.
The coroner pointed them towards the train trestle 75 feet away. Police combed the trestle. Among the overgrowth, they recovered 4 spent rifle casings. Ballistics analysts determined that they were shot from a .44 Ruger carbine rifle. Months had passed since the double murder in Cincinnati, and detectives had no suspects. No one knew why someone would want to kill the teenagers.
This wasn't the typical homicide. When you have 2 children, 13, 14-year-old children that are shot, sniper-style shooting with no clear motive, 2 children on their way to a candy store. It obviously had the city and the neighborhood in an uproar.
When O'Brien heard about the Salt Lake City sniper, he invited the detectives to Cincinnati to compare the cases more closely. To Salt Lake City Detective Bell, the connection was significant. It revealed a breed of killer not encountered before 1980.
Once we were made aware of this information, we were pretty much convinced that we were dealing with the same killer from back east. And this was actually our real first involvement with what is commonly now referred to as a traveling serial killer. This was a new concept to everybody, not just out in Salt Lake. It was a new concept anywhere in the country that killers would just travel across the country.
While police from both states met in Cincinnati to search for answers, Detective Bell in Salt Lake City followed up on the slim lead from the prostitute named Mickey. She told him that she'd spent time with a man named Bill Hagman at the Regal Inn Motel. He carried guns and drove a Camaro like one described by witnesses close to the crime scene. At the motel, Bell found a registration card signed by Hagman and dated August 16th, 4 days before the murders. The address Hagman listed was in Kentucky.
We had the FBI run the name through their entire database. They had nothing on that name. So we felt fairly confident that everything he'd put on this registration slip was fraudulent.
FBI labs in Washington, D.C. dusted the card for latent fingerprints, but found none. They also analyzed Hagman's handwriting and noted some unique characteristics that would make it easy to identify. They had no proof he was the killer, but he was the only lead they had. Although it was a long shot, a team of 20 detectives spread out to search other motels in the area. They carried copies of Hagman's Regal Inn registration card, hoping to match his handwriting in the event he used a different alias. Agent Jensen recalls the extensive search.
And they conducted a search of all motel rooms from Ogden, which is 30 miles north of Salt Lake, to Provo, which is 30 miles south. And they located about 8 motels where this individual had stayed using false names, each one different, using phony addresses, and using false license numbers for his car.
Local investigators also discovered the suspect had stayed at the Scenic Motel on August 20th, the day of the murders. It was just 9 blocks from the shootings in Liberty Park. Though Hagman used different names at each motel, the FBI labs confirmed the handwriting was the same. One of the cards yielded a fingerprint. But a check in the National Fingerprint Database turned up nothing.
Is this one of your motel registrations?
At the Sandman Motel, they got another break.
Help me out for a second.
Detectives discovered that his registration card listed a Camaro with its license plate number.
Okay, now, I see a license number.
But a second license number was written in the margin by the motel's owner.
Yes, I do. I wrote that number there. That's the correct number.
He must have been in his late 70s, early 80s. He went out every night around 3 o'clock in the morning and would take all of his motel registration slips and walk by all the cars and check their license plate numbers against what were put on the cards, because he was so sure that his guests were going to steal a pillow or a pillowcase.
When the owner checked the plates on Hagman's Camaro against his registration, the numbers didn't match. So he recorded the correct Kentucky plates in the margin of the card. A DMV search revealed the license plate and the Camaro were registered to a member of a prominent Louisville, Kentucky family. The Salt Lake City detectives shared their discovery with detectives in Cincinnati.
They immediately responded to Louisville and made contact with the police agency there and tracked down the actual registered owner of this car. He had in fact sold the car to another person some months before.
The Louisville man showed detectives the sales receipt. Police took down the name of the purchaser, the car's mileage, and its brand of tires. But their troubles weren't over. The purchaser had used a false name. The seller worked with a police sketch artist to render a composite of the buyer, a slender white man with a Kentucky accent. Back in Salt Lake City, Mickey and her roommate were also providing detectives with a composite sketch of the man who called himself Hagman.
At the same time, I met with Mickey, the part-time hook, and her roommate was actually an artist, a student who was studying art, and she did a freehand drawing to begin with. And then we asked her if she could work with our composite, and she did. And she put together a composite of this man.
Hey, Ron, how's it going?
How you doing, Mark?
All right. What do you got?
When the composite drawing from Louisville arrived in Utah, detectives compared the two renderings.
Good morning.
They were remarkably similar. Investigators now had the face of the suspected serial killer. Investigators hunted a serial killer who had murdered 2 young African Americans in Cincinnati and 2 more in Salt Lake City. They now had a sketch of their suspect, but lead detective Don Bell still had no name and no hard evidence connecting him with the murders.
We didn't have anything to charge him with. However, we did find a motel that he stayed here in Salt Lake for 2 nights. Since he left without paying, we immediately applied for a warrant, which was granted, and we charged him with defrauding an innkeeper or failure to pay. We issued that warrant under every single name that had been found on every single motel registration card.
The FBI entered the warrant, the license plate, and all of his aliases into the NCIC, the National Crime Information Center, a computer database that links over 57,000 law agencies nationwide. On September 25, 1980, over a month after the Salt Lake City murders, the FBI database paid off. When officers in Boone County, Kentucky arrived at a local motel to arrest a pair of jewelry thieves, the manager told them that one of his patrons was complaining about the lights and noise from their vehicles.
7, 8 police cars in the parking lot with the red lights going and the radios blaring, and another person living in this motel took offense at being disturbed by all this noise and called the manager's office and said, "What are the cops doing there, and how come it's so noisy, and I'm going to leave if you don't quiet down." And so the manager went out and approached one of the Boone County officials and said, "My tenant is really upset that you're causing all this trouble."
When the sergeant asked who was complaining, the night manager told them that the calls were coming from room 80. Perturbed, the sergeant ran the license plate of the Camaro registered for the man in that room. The computer check, tied into the FBI database, turned up the warrant from Utah. Boone County sheriffs went to room 80. A slender, white male with a southern accent answered the door. Inside, officers saw 2 shotguns on the bed. They cuffed him and brought him in for questioning. This time, the fugitive registered with his real name, Joseph Paul Franklin. They notified Salt Lake City investigators that they had their man. Detective Bell and his colleague were on the next plane to Kentucky. But when they arrived, Boone County sheriffs had alarming news. The fugitive had escaped from his low-security room.
At some time during the interview, the detective briefly leaves the room to get something to drink for this subject and himself, and it's at that point that this individual makes his escape out the window and is gone.
Investigators still held his Camaro, his weapons, and wallet containing his driver's license and photo. Salt Lake City Detective Bell recalled how closely the photo matched the 2 composites.
Looking at that license, it was almost eerie. It almost looked like that the composite that had been built in Kentucky and the composite that I built out here in Salt Lake, that we had done it using Joseph Paul Franklin's driver's license.
The suspected serial killer was still 1 step ahead. The FBI issued a federal warrant for unlawful flight to avoid prosecution.
One was killed right at the scene.
Investigators hoped the resources of the FBI could stop the killer before he struck again. The fugitive's face and description flooded the media nationwide. Agent Jensen spearheaded the manhunt for the FBI.
He was almost immediately put on the 10 most wanted list because of the notoriety and because of the seriousness of the crime, the fact that he was a suspect not only in this crime, but in the assassination of a number of black people all across the United States. These were cases that hadn't been solved.
To make the most wanted fugitives list, Franklin's file was reviewed among hundreds of others. Special agents at FBI headquarters decide the 10 most wanted based on a suspect's immediate danger to society, that the suspect won't stop killing until he's caught. News of the killer's escape brought a flurry of sightings, including one from a Kentucky teenager. He said a man had offered him $100 to take him across the river to a shopping mall in Cincinnati. Investigators swarmed the mall to interview anyone who thought they'd seen him. They discovered the suspected serial killer had purchased new clothes and had his hair cut and dyed. Franklin had changed his appearance and still had a source of cash. Back in Kentucky, evidence technicians scoured the Camaro for clues. They took photos of its tires, hoping to match them with tread marks found near the crime scene in Salt Lake City. They matched. For Detective Bell, it was a major breakthrough.
The tires were sort of a new prototype that were only being released east of the Mississippi. So for tires to show in a dirt field in Salt Lake City They would have had to have been purchased at that time east of the Mississippi that placed that car with that man in our city.
At the FBI ballistics lab in Washington, D.C., examiners analyzed the weapons Franklin had left behind. They hoped to determine that one of the guns was the murder weapon.
He had 2 rifles and 2 handguns. The FBI was able to compare the ballistics of these weapons with the bullets that were recovered from the victims' bodies. These did not match.
The FBI also searched the NCIC database for criminal records and outstanding warrants for Joseph Paul Franklin. They discovered that Franklin had legally changed his name.
Have some more information.
What do you got?
His birth name was James Clayton Vaughn. The information allowed investigators to dig more deeply into his past.
Yep.
Joseph Paul Franklin, a suspected serial killer targeting African-American men, had escaped from police in Kentucky and was still on the run. The FBI had determined that he changed his name from James Clayton Vaughn. Agents and local detectives traced his history to his hometown in Birdtown, Alabama. They spoke with people who knew him. For Cincinnati detective Mike O'Brien, a clearer picture of the fugitive started to emerge.
Birdtown is described as basically one side of the track is black and the other side is white. And so there was a lot of racial tension in his upbringing. There was a lot of problems between whites and blacks in that area. His mother had relatives that had been in World War II on the side of Nazi Germany. Franklin, at one point, had said he had read Mein Kampf and was very impressed with this writing.
Joseph Paul Franklin had selected his new name to honor one of his heroes, Hitler's chief propagandist, Paul Joseph Goebbels. The FBI tracked his movements over the previous year and found that they coincided with several unsolved bank robberies.
That's him. That's him.
Agents also learned that 2 years earlier, he had sent a letter threatening to kill President Jimmy Carter because of his pro-civil rights views. The president was currently campaigning in the South, where Franklin had last been spotted. The election was just weeks away. If Franklin was going to make good on his threat, it would be soon. Detective Bell remembers that the FBI and Secret Service rushed into action.
Well, they decided that Joseph Paul Franklin, also James Clayton Vaughn, was definitely a threat to President Carter because he had written that he would like to kill him. So they passed pictures of Joseph Paul Franklin in every city that the president was going to visit.
The FBI had to get to Franklin before Franklin got to the president.
We were able to, through contacting his friends, determine that during the process of his flight, he was selling his blood plasma to obtain money to live on. And as a result of that, we sent bulletins out to all of the blood plasma centers in the southeastern part of the United States.
Clinics across the South received packets from the FBI with information on the killer, now suspected of murder in at least 7 states.
Miss Jackson, are you okay?
I'm just so dizzy.
Okay, well, lay down there for a minute. It's going to take just a few minutes to...
On October 28th, Franklin entered a clinic in the Tampa area to sell his plasma. The technician prepping him recognized the tattoos from the FBI packet, the Grim Reaper and the American Eagle.
Is this your first time giving blood?
Oh my gosh, I'm so dizzy.
Franklin figured selling his blood was safer than robbery for a man on the run.
I do it all the time.
He was wrong.
There is?
The technician phoned the number the FBI provided.
Yeah, okay, great. I'll keep you busy.
Federal agents surrounded the clinic and moved in to arrest Franklin. This time, there would be no mistakes. The killer went quietly without a fight. Franklin was taken to Salt Lake City to stand trial for the murders of Ted Fields and David Martin. But Detective Bell suddenly found the entire homicide case in jeopardy.
The county attorney didn't feel that we had a strong enough case. It was purely circumstantial as far as he was concerned, and he wasn't willing to go to court on just a purely circumstantial case. But the federal government, through the FBI, decided to step in at that time, and they felt that they had a very good, strong case to bring civil rights violations against him.
The civil rights conviction would present obstacles of its own. Prosecutors would have to prove not only that he had committed the homicides in Utah, but that he was motivated out of racial hatred. The FBI held suspected serial killer Joseph Paul Franklin in Salt Lake City, while federal prosecutors built a case to prove his murders were racially motivated. Agents re-interviewed his associates, family, and 2 ex-wives in order to get a clearer picture of Franklin's racial beliefs. Agent Jensen sent his team to Franklin's hometown of Birdtown, Alabama.
We were able to go back and meet with people that knew him, and we were able to develop a history of him, if you will, as to what he was like, the fact that he had been associated with the Ku Klux Klan. He'd been associated with the American Nazi Party. The fact that he'd been arrested a number of times for disorderly conduct, and in some instances because he possessed a weapon.
Prosecutors pursued witnesses who could testify to Franklin's whereabouts and his racist views. At one motel, a manager agreed to speak at trial about his encounter with Franklin.
The police had found a motel where he had stayed before the shooting took place, and he'd gone and registered in the office, and then he went to the room, pulled down the covers, and found black hair in the bed. This upset him greatly, and so he became irate, went back to the office and yelled and screamed and made a number of racial statements against black people.
Wherever they went, investigators found witnesses who remembered Franklin's car. Assistant U.S. Attorney Steve Snar recalls that Franklin's Camaro proved crucial to his case.
The car that Mr. Franklin was driving was unique. It had a unique color. It had red pinstriping that was a custom kind of striping. It also had unique interior features and non-standard tires and other features that were noticeable to various witnesses who had observed the car in the Salt Lake area.
And he pulled up and asked
The investigative team also interviewed 2 young women who had ridden in Franklin's Camaro.
We came up with 2 girls, a lady by the name of Sandra and another one by the name of Rhonda, who actually at 4 o'clock, 4:30, 4:45 on the day of the killing, were hitchhiking a couple of blocks away from the park. This man in the Camaro picked them up, and they needed to get to the downtown bank to deposit their paycheck before it closed at 5.
As they got in the car, Franklin asked them if black people hung out in the park. One of the girls, who was dating a black man, said yes. Before he dropped them off, he handed them printed cards that said, "Take off your clothes." Bell sent the cards to the FBI lab, and examiners were able to conclusively match them to similar cards found in the glove compartment of Franklin's Camaro. The timing of the women's story was also compelling.
They actually saw him again that night, a block and a half away from the park at 8:30. So little by little, we're putting him almost in the park at the same time the victims were.
At the Salt Lake County Jail, Franklin was held in a double lockup since he had previously escaped from police custody.
Close 3.
While there, he became friendly with Robert Herrera, an inmate serving time for burglary. Herrera had more recently been disciplined for brawling with a black inmate. Although the fight was not racially motivated, Franklin assumed Herrera held the same hatred of African Americans. He looked to Herrera as a confidant. Agent Jensen recalls the importance of this relationship.
He told Herrera, he confessed to Herrera that he had shot the two joggers in Salt Lake City, and also confessed to a homicide in Oklahoma City.
Herrera arranged a meeting with the FBI and local investigators. He had a proposition for them.
How's it going?
Herrera would become a federal witness against Franklin if the state would guarantee his early release. Franklin told Herrera why he shot the couples in Liberty Park. He said he believed people of different races should never mix. When Franklin saw the black men walking with white girls in the park, he felt they should die. Investigators were not convinced they could trust Herrera. A confession to a convict would not ensure a successful prosecution.
You know, we've got one phone, two people. We have to coordinate out here too.
When investigators requested more information, Herrera told them about Franklin's whereabouts following the Salt Lake City murders.
Well, I can tell you what he did after the shootings. He did the shootings, he left here, he went north to a town north of Salt Lake, Ogden. He took the freeway across Nevada through Winnemucca, Battle Mountain, Reno, and into San Francisco, and he sold the rifle that he killed the kids at a flea market outside of the Bay Area.
Agents and local investigators needed to confirm Herrera's story. If they could find the rifle Franklin had used in Liberty Park, investigators would have the piece they were missing. Detective Bell sent his team to the flea market outside San Francisco. They interviewed gun dealers and other witnesses.
So they saturated the flea market, and they did come up with witnesses who remembered Joseph Paul Franklin and remembered that he was selling guns. But we could never find the gun.
Even without the weapon, Herrera's story was confirmed. Franklin's movements following the murders would be critical for the prosecution.
Well, this was pretty good information because we'd never been able, the FBI, ourselves, no one had ever been able to find out where Mr. Franklin had gone after doing the killing.
After agents corroborated his story, they met with Herrera again. He told investigators about other crimes Franklin confessed to. Franklin admitted shooting hustler publisher Larry Flint, crippling him in 1977 for portraying black men with white women in his magazine. Franklin also said he shot Vernon Jordan, the president of the National Urban League, in May of 1980. Federal prosecutors felt they had enough to bring the civil rights case to trial.
Well, the prosecution was an involved prosecution involving 65 witnesses and approximately 100 different exhibits. However, we managed to expedite the case and move things along in telling our story and recreating the actions and things that took place. The trial lasted 5.5 days and we were done.
The jury deliberated just 5 hours, finding Joseph Paul Franklin guilty of the federal civil rights violations. The judge sentenced him to 2 life terms. Franklin was furious that he was going to prison for the rest of his life, but more so because an African-American prosecutor helped put him there. In a rage, Franklin jumped out of his chair and threw water on the attorney. He was quickly subdued by the marshals and carted away. In an interview following his sentencing, Franklin finally admitted to investigators what motivated the killings in Utah and across the country.
He said himself that he is a racist, that he had a plan to assassinate as many blacks as he could. This was his whole purpose.
After the successful federal trial, the Salt Lake County prosecutor felt he could win a state homicide case against Franklin. Franklin was escorted to the courthouse where he had spent the last 2 months during the federal trial. During a recess, he was left unattended in a holding room. before the court officer returned, he freed himself and pried the door off its hinges. Franklin had escaped.
No one knew how he had escaped from the holding cell. But when the jailers went to bring him back into court before the jury came in, he wasn't in the conference room.
Jeff! Jeff!
It looked as if Joseph Paul Franklin was free once again to continue his path of terror. The elevator was his only way out, and only operable with a guard's key. But a marshal found the control panel dismantled. Franklin had hot-wired it using only a dime and a paper clip.
He was able to take the plate off the elevator, the prisoner elevator, and strip the wires and call the elevator to that floor. And then he disappeared.
Police closed off the streets as jailers searched the courthouse for the fugitive.
The rest of us, we immediately put out an area-wide alert that this man had escaped, and we brought every available officer there was scouring the downtown area. At the same time, the jailer decided that maybe he noticed that the top panel on the elevator had been loosened. So he climbed up on top of the elevator and noticed some movement in the dust and thought, well, somehow he's in this building. So that particular jailer started crawling every single air duct in the courthouse.
He found him. Franklin scurried like a rat in the ductwork, always remaining out of his reach. But when Franklin came to the end of the duct, a second guard was waiting.
Got your bracelets right here.
Yeah, well.
He was back in custody within an hour.
That's it. Get him out of here.
We cleaned him off and combed his hair and brought him back in. And the jury was none the wiser. They just got an extra hour for lunch.
Over his next 17 years in prison, Franklin confessed to 16 murders in 8 states. In all that time, he never admitted to the double homicide in Cincinnati. Detective Mike O'Brien never gave up. He continued to build his case, hoping to convict Franklin of the Cincinnati murders. O'Brien's break came when he was able to convince Franklin to interview with Melissa Powers, an assistant district attorney from Cincinnati.
The minute that Mr. Franklin walked in the room and sat down, and Miss Powers introduced herself, told him who she was, why she was there, he said, "You know I did it. I killed those 2 kids in Cincinnati." Immediately, as he sat down, which was what I've been trying to get him to do for some 17 years, he did in a matter of about 30 seconds.
In 1998, Franklin received 2 more life sentences for the Cincinnati murders. In Missouri, he was sentenced to death for 2 others. Franklin would never have another opportunity to escape. Detective Don Bell remained haunted by Franklin's rampage of violence.
I don't understand this type of killer, that he would actually just take a complete stranger, and because of their race and who they were standing by or talking to, he would feel it necessary to kill him. He's one of those few people that I just have absolutely no explanation for, and it's still hard for me to understand.
For the families of Franklin's victims, peace had finally come. Franklin would never be free to kill again. A serial killer was on the loose in western New York. He chose his victims for the color of their skin. The community was gripped by fear, not knowing when or where he would strike next. The only evidence he left behind was spent shell casings. To focus their search, local authorities called on an FBI profiler for help. They needed to stop his murderous rampage before the killer ended another life.
In Buffalo, New York, a sniper targeted African-American men. He held a city hostage and threatened to ignite a racial powder keg. And it looked like others might be following his bloody example. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. When it became clear that physical evidence alone wasn't enough to corner the killer, FBI profilers developed other means. Their work provided the only hope of flushing him out and connecting him to his crimes.
On September 22, 1980, in Buffalo, New York, Larry Robinson drove up to a supermarket with Glenn Dunn. Dunn promised to wait while Robinson went in to cash his paycheck. While he waited, Dunn decided to step out of the car for a cigarette. At about 9:45 p.m., psychiatric nurse Madonna Gorney just finished her shift. On her way home, she decided to pick up some groceries. Not far from where she parked, Gorney spotted Dunn fidgeting in the shadows. She was alone and felt unsafe. There had been robberies in the area, and Gorney did not want to be another victim. She headed straight for the lit entrance, where she passed another man who appeared to be waiting for a ride. Gorney felt safer once inside. Larry Robinson had only a short wait in line to collect his money. Looking for his ride, he noticed Dunn's car parked at the end of the building. When Robinson tried to get in, the door was locked. Dunn did not respond. Robinson came around to the driver's side and discovered Dunn was not moving. He was bleeding from the head. Robinson ran back into the store to summon help. When Madonna Gorney left the store, she noticed commotion at the end of the building and asked if she could be of any help. The security guard replied that it wasn't necessary. The situation was under control. With 3 bullet wounds to his head, Dunn was in critical condition. Paramedics struggled to save the young victim. His heart had stopped. Efforts to revive him were futile. He was pronounced dead on arrival. When police informed Dunn's family, they discovered he was only 14 years old. A forensics team searched for clues to the killer's identity. Fingerprints lifted from the car belonged to Dunn and Robinson. The blood was confirmed as Dunn's. The only trace left by the assailant was spent bullet casings. They had been fired from a .22 caliber weapon. A check of the car's license plates revealed it had been stolen the night before from a local dealer. Police questioned Robinson. He told them that he only knew Dunn casually from the neighborhood and did not know the car had been stolen. Robinson said he'd been walking to the supermarket earlier in the evening when Dunn drove up and offered a ride. Friends and family would later confirm that he and Dunn barely knew each other.
I'm here at the top supermarket.
The crime was already making news. As the story broke, Madonna Gorney returned home from the supermarket, still troubled by the incident.
But they did confirm that he is a 14-year-old local resident.
Gorney was upset to learn that a young boy had been killed in the parking lot. She decided to call police the next morning to see if she could be of any help. Buffalo homicide detective John Regan initially thought the slaying might be a result of a car theft ring.
Exploring where the stolen car had come from and the people that may have been responsible for it, it became apparent that this was not the focal point of the investigation.
To develop leads, police canvassed nearby residents hoping someone may have witnessed the shooting. A uniformed officer found a witness willing to cooperate and called a detective to question her. Barbara Wozniak lived next door to the supermarket. She told the detectives that she had heard the gunfire and seen the assailant.
Well, we just start from the beginning.
At around 9:45 on the previous evening, she was cooking when she heard 3 pop-like sounds. She hurried to her window to see what had caused the noises. She saw a white man running from a parked car. He wore a hooded sweatshirt that obscured his face.
Anything else, anything you forgot?
While the detective spoke to Wozniak, he was informed that a witness from the supermarket had called offering her help. It was psychiatric nurse Madonna Gorney.
The real reason I called was because a 14-year-old kid had been killed in that car the night before, and all I could think of at the time was, I'm a mother. If somebody killed my kid, I would really want to know who it was.
Gorney recounted what she had seen that night at the supermarket, hoping it would be of some help.
When I pulled in, I noticed a man standing under the lamppost near the edge of the parking lot. When I got out of the car, I purposely walked farther away from him, with the idea that, yeah, I was alone, it was dark. If he was standing there, he was probably up to no good, and I didn't want to be part of it.
Anxious, Gorney looked for other people who might be of assistance if she were to become a victim of crime.
My first reaction was, wow, there is somebody else out here. As I walked closer to the door and was able to get a better look at him, I thought to myself, if something does happen, he's not going to be of any help to me, because basically he had a very dazed or very dopey look on his face, and I wasn't impressed.
She described him as a slender white man with dark hair who held a brown paper bag on his lap. He wore metal-rimmed glasses and a hooded sweatshirt which shadowed his features. The description seemed promising since the previous witness had described a similar man running from the scene. Detectives hoped that Gorney could provide details for a sketch. After talking to Gorney, Buffalo detectives got word of a similar shooting in the nearby suburb of Cheektowaga. The victim, 32-year-old Harold Green, was rushed into emergency surgery as detectives arrived at the hospital. His situation was critical after being shot in the left side of the head with .22 caliber slugs.
Are you with the green down in there?
Detectives found his wife in the waiting room and asked what she knew of the shooting. Her husband had stopped at a fast food restaurant. He was sitting in his car eating his lunch when a hooded white assailant walked up and shot him. When an employee heard the gunfire and saw the shooter sprint from the scene with a brown paper bag, she called her manager. The method of this attack resembled the one from the night before. Detectives speculated that there was a possible connection between the two victims. Mrs. Green said neither she nor her husband knew Glenn Dunn or his family. Her husband was a successful engineer and a pillar in his community. He moved in different circles than the teenage car thief. Investigators found the two victims shared nothing in common. Green died without regaining consciousness. Only one piece of evidence linked both shootings. Lieutenant Thomas Rowan of the Cheektowaga Police Department led the forensic investigation.
We had our first piece of hard physical evidence that connected the shooting in Cheektowaga at the fast food restaurant, the shooting which took place in Buffalo, New York. That single fact that tied everything together was spent cartridge casings from a .22 caliber. At that point, it was only identified as a firearm because we didn't know what type of firearm had produced the spent shell casing.
That same night, homicide detectives were summoned to another shooting. It was the third attack on an African-American man in less than 36 hours. 31-year-old Emmanuel Thomas had been killed while crossing a residential intersection. From eyewitness accounts, the investigators pieced together the chain of events. An hour earlier, Frenchie Cook left the home of his friend Emmanuel Thomas. Thomas, a freelance house painter, told his wife he was going to the store and would be right back.
Be careful.
Neighbor Thomas Jackson saw the two friends walk by and head for the corner of East Ferry and Zenner Streets. As Thomas and Cook crossed the intersection, the killer struck from out of the darkness. With a gun concealed in a paper bag, he shot Thomas several times in the left side of the head. Thomas collapsed to the pavement. Frenchie Cook was in shock. He never saw the assailant approach. He did not know anyone that would want Emmanuel Thomas dead. A teenage witness who saw the shooting from across the street described the suspect as a hooded white male, around 5'8" or 5'9". The forensic team retrieved .22 caliber shells resembling those found from the previous shootings. They were sent to the lab for comparison. Detectives had little else to go on.
In this particular case, we had two common denominators. We had black men and we had a .22 caliber weapon that was used to kill them. Other than that, there were no connections between the victims, either collectively or even singly, and no connection with a shooter.
Startled investigators came to the realization that Buffalo had a serial killer on the loose. Police had no leads and only one apparent motive. Assistant District Attorney John DeFranks was called in to monitor the case.
We uncovered no evidence that there was a robbery motive. We uncovered no evidence that this was a situation involving bad blood between the attacker and the victim. What we had was an assassin randomly shooting people on the basis of race.
With the identity of the racist assassin unknown, the press dubbed him the .22 caliber killer. He was already on the prowl for his next victim. The .22 caliber killer was preying on African American men in Buffalo, New York, killing 3 in 36 hours and leaving little evidence behind. Emmanuel Thomas had been the killer's latest victim, gunned down crossing the street in front of his home. Medical examiners performed an autopsy. They found powder burns near the entry wounds. This meant that the muzzle of the murder weapon was placed close to his temple. From the pattern and severity of the burns, examiners believed they were caused by a sawed-off rifle. They removed 2 mangled .22 caliber slugs from his head and sent them to the ballistics lab for analysis. As investigators searched for answers, community fear turned into anger. Erie County District Attorney Ed Cosgrove was in charge of coordinating the hunt.
The black community demanded action by the police. And of course, because of the nature of the attacks and because of the psychotic nature of the person ultimately responsible, it wasn't going to be an easy task.
The next day, on September 24th, Joseph McCoy walked down a residential street in Niagara Falls, 20 miles north of Buffalo. In front of a church, the 43-year-old man was ambushed and killed. A witness described the shooter as a slender white man dressed in khakis. Once again, police found nothing but .22 caliber shells at the scene. The shells, along with the slugs extracted from the victim, were sent to the Erie County Department of Central Police Services to compare to the others. Lieutenant Thomas Rowan conducted the ballistics analysis.
In this case, it presented a rather difficult challenge to the firearms examiners and to law enforcement, is that the bullets themselves, as it went into the body, they broke up, they disintegrated, and broke into tiny little pieces, making specific identification of the weapon from the bullets inside of the victims very difficult, not impossible for the firearms examiners.
The shell casings could tell them more. Every gun leaves specific marks on a shell when it fires. The firing pin, ejector, and extractor from a weapon make impressions on the casings. For examiners, this is the gun's fingerprint. They found that the markings on the casings from the 4 crime scenes all matched.
The relationship of the firing pin impression, the ejector, and the extractor marks suggested fairly early on that a specific type of weapon was used, and that was a Ruger Model 1022.
The fourth shooting sent more shockwaves through the black community, and investigators still had no suspect. Local officials had no answers. They called on the FBI for assistance. Special Agent Chip Mrazowitz realized the case had the greatest urgency for the community.
It was important for the FBI to get involved in this case because there were African Americans being killed in the area, and everybody was scared to walk the streets, daytime and nighttime.
A composite sketch was rendered by an FBI artist who worked with several witnesses that had gotten glimpses of the killer. The sketch was circulated through patrols, newspapers, and television. Police also carried the sketch door to door, hoping that someone would recognize the suspect. When thousands of calls began to pour in, Detective Regan realized the composite did little to focus the investigation.
Basically, the composite sketch was like Everyman. As a result of it being published, I think we got somewhere around in the neighborhood of 6,000 calls that had to be checked out. And one of the fears really is that you may actually get the suspect, and because you've done so many of these, it becomes routine and you don't pay attention. That's the ultimate fear, that you go right by the man.
While local investigators tracked down leads in the Buffalo area, FBI agents pursued those outside of Erie County. Leads were followed in Pennsylvania, Ohio, all of New England, and across the border in Canada.
To have that many leads, we were occupied 24 hours a day. We were looking for one lone white male who possibly could be walking next to you in a street or having lunch with you at some cafeteria, and you don't know if you had the .22 caliber killer next to you.
On October 8, 1980, workers on a construction site in the Buffalo suburb of Amherst came across an abandoned taxi on the service road of the New York Thruway. When no one returned to move it, they contacted the state police. The trooper who responded inspected the empty cab. He found a wallet under the front seat that held a driver's license but no money. It belonged to 71-year-old Parler W. Edwards, an African-American cab driver. The keys were missing, and Edwards was nowhere in sight. The trooper decided to search the trunk, but found it locked.
No keys? Nothing.
Using a crowbar, he forced it open. He found the missing driver.
Parler Edwards was literally bludgeoned to death in a parking lot in the town of Cheektowaga. We found pieces of his skull, parts of his mouth, teeth that had been knocked out, a great deal of blood.
Before throwing Edwards' body into the trunk, the killer had also cut open the driver's chest and removed his heart. It wasn't clear that the Edwards slaying was connected to the others, since a .22 caliber rifle was not used.
The fact that he was a black male certainly raised suspicion in the minds of the investigators. Said, could the killer have now progressed to mutilation of the body in this case?
No one knew for sure. Perhaps it was an isolated incident perpetrated by a copycat killer. Manpower dedicated to the murders swelled to 150 personnel from various agencies. The hotline rang 24 hours a day. No calls led to a suspect. With community pressure mounting, the frustration grew for Special Agent Richard Faireye.
In this case, we had several crimes occurring. We had no evidence to indicate who that person was responsible. And for an investigator, it was extremely difficult for us to accept the fact that we could not find anything that could identify this person positively.
Early on October 9th, a water worker was driving towards a dock area in the town of Tonawanda, just a few miles from Buffalo. On the edge of the road, he spotted a man laying face down near the tall grass. The worker approached and saw that the man wasn't breathing. He immediately called authorities. They arrived within minutes. Investigators identified the victim as 41-year-old Ernest Jones. Like Edwards, Jones was a taxi driver who had his throat slashed and heart cut out before his body was moved to a remote location. He was the 6th African-American male to be murdered in the Buffalo area in less than 3 weeks. Authorities were baffled. With little evidence to guide them, they weren't sure if one person was responsible for all 6 homicides. Only one aspect linked the first 4 shootings with the deaths of the 2 cabbies.
Basically what you have is the 4 shootings which are definitely linked. You have the 2 cab drivers who are linked to each other, but not necessarily to this. There's controversy even within the police, within teams of investigators as to whether or not they're connected.
Agents and local authorities had no way of knowing if there were 1 or 2 serial killers out there killing black men. By October 9th, 1980, 6 African-American men had been found slain in the Buffalo area. Authorities were not certain that only one person was responsible. In just 3 weeks, the serial killings had split the local community along racial lines. District Attorney Edward Cosgrove led the investigation.
It's hard to even describe the community mind at that time. There were demands for action all over from the black community for the police to stop what was happening here. I had press conferences that were attended by the national press. Everybody descended upon Buffalo, and everybody wanted answers from me. I didn't have the answers.
The story made national headlines. a $100,000 reward was offered for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the .22 caliber killer. President Jimmy Carter took notice. With the wedge of civil rights violations dividing the Buffalo community, the president declared the investigation a federal case. Local lawmen now had the full resources of the FBI at their disposal. As federal agents began sifting through the collected information, another incident rocked upstate New York. On the night of October 10th, Colin Cole slept in Buffalo General Hospital. Cole was an inmate from a local jail recuperating from a drug overdose. Just as visiting hours were coming to a close, a man walked down the hall of the 7th floor looking for Cole's room. The recovering addict gasped for breath as the man tightened the ligature. A nurse administering medication surprised the strangler. He fled, leaving Cole alive. The nurse alerted hospital security. But the call came too late. It was the 7th attack on a black man in just 3 weeks. No one knew for sure if the .22 caliber killer was responsible for this attack.
What we have is the crime scene.
Lieutenant Thomas Rowan and his team had little understanding of serial killers at the time.
Glimpsing into the mind of a serial killer is like twinkling your toes into the abyss of the very weird. You're never really sure what's there.
Local investigators needed someone who was more familiar with these types of offenders. They called upon John Douglas of the FBI Behavioral Sciences Unit to provide a profile of the .22 caliber killer. Through this process, Douglas would provide the team with insight to the killer's psychological behavior. Currently senior analyst of appbnews.com, an online crime news website, Douglas spent 20 years pioneering the science of profiling.
A profile is designed to come up with the most probable offender. Its goal is to eliminate a lot of false leads. An attempt is being made as well to maybe refocus the investigation of law enforcement or possibly reinforce the investigation by telling them that you're on the right track here.
Douglas was on the next plane to Buffalo. During the trip, he familiarized himself with the case files.
You have to walk in the shoes of both the subject and walk in the shoes of that victim to truly understand really what took place during that assault. I'm going to be asking myself the question, why? Why this victim?
He confirmed what local investigators believed. The only connections among the 6 murder victims were their race and sex. They were black men who had been chosen by at least one killer as targets of opportunity. The strangled survivor, Colin Cole, was not a random victim since he had been sought out in his hospital room. The profiler believed Cole's attacker was at the very least a racist copycat, not necessarily responsible for any of the murders. Douglas needed to probe further. He had to meticulously recreate each murder from the known evidence. Reviewing all 6 attacks, the profiler looked for behavioral characteristics that could be ascribed to just one offender.
When you look at serial killers, you look at patterns as well as signature. Signature is something that the offender does. It's kind of repetitive behavior, but behavior that the subject has to do. It's more of a ritual.
Douglas found the behavior from each of the 4 shootings to be similar. The .22 caliber killer had surprised random victims, fired quickly from close range, then bolted, leaving his prey before they were dead. The assassin's signature was a blitz style of attack. The cabbie murders didn't seem to fit that pattern. In those 2 cases, the killer had severely bludgeoned the victims, mutilated them, then dumped them far from where they were killed. The killer had spent a great deal of time with the bodies, even after death. To Douglas, this suggested two different killers.
There are different types of serial killer. They're the very personal types of serial killers and the impersonal style and type of serial killer. The personal type of an offender wants to look in the eyes of the victim, and they want to spend hours, if at all possible, with their victims, be in a position of total control and domination. That's what really is going to turn them on.
It appeared the cabbies were murdered by a personal type of serial killer. Those crimes demonstrated a rage and overkill that were not evident in the shootings. Douglas believed that the psychopathology of the .22 caliber killer left a seemingly different behavioral thumbprint.
The assassination style of serial killer are somewhere in an age group between 25 to 28 is when they first begin to surface. And how they could be described as really more of an asocial type of personality, not so much antisocial, but asocial, keeping to themselves. They generally become obsessed with weapons. They may be found with having multiple weapons as well. The person would probably, if he was in the military, I said that he'd have difficulty in any branch of the service and would probably, at some point, would even receive a discharge.
To the profiler, it looked as if Western New York may have had two distinct serial killers on the loose. Douglas reported his findings to local investigators. Because the technique of profiling was new in 1980, a few had doubts about its reliability.
Some people look at this as this is some type of voodoo or witchcraft. I mean, how are you able to determine, for example, age of the offender? And actually, it's pretty easy once you do enough of these cases.
From his experience with similar cases, the profiler added that the .22 caliber killer would most likely be an avid hunter, having a history of menial jobs. Douglas stressed that it was up to the local team to find or eliminate suspects based on his profile.
This is a good tool, but really it's you. You're the people up there, you police, you're going to solve the case. I'm not going to solve the case. To me, this is the easy part. I'm just going to try to help you maybe refocus the case, give you an idea, paint a portrait of the offender, but really you're the one who's going to knock on the doors and wear out the leather soles and come up with the suspect.
A national all-points bulletin of the .22 caliber killer's profile was received by law enforcement agencies around the country. Investigators had a description, but still had no name. Late in 1980, the FBI and local police searched for leads in the unsolved murders of 6 black men from Western New York. Hoping to focus the massive investigation, an FBI profiler was called in to assess connections between the cases. He believed it was possible that 2 distinct racist killers were responsible. 2,000 suspects were interrogated, but police made no arrests. Buffalo wasn't the only city in New York State facing terror in the streets. 400 miles southeast, in New York City, a knife-wielding attacker was terrorizing Midtown. Commuter Ivan Frazier was the victim of a subway knifing 3 days before Christmas. Blocking the attack with his arm, he survived and reported the assault to the NYPD. At 1:25 in the afternoon, Ivan Frazier noticed another rider talking with an attractive woman. To Frazier, it appeared the man was trying to pick her up. The woman seemed annoyed and got up to exit at the next stop. Frazier returned to his article. Without warning, the man across the aisle slashed Frazier in the forearm and wrist, then dashed away. He described the assailant as a white man in his early 30s with brown hair, wearing a blue jacket. 2 hours later, at 3:30 in the afternoon, 19-year-old Luis Rodriguez was walking on the west side of Midtown Manhattan when he was jumped by a white man demanding his wallet.
crazy?
Rodriguez fought off the initial blow, but the attacker lunged at him again, stabbing him twice in the chest. Before he died, Rodriguez described him to police as a white man with brown hair wearing a blue jacket. 3 hours after Rodriguez, Antoine Davis was found stabbed to death in front of a Midtown bank. By 10:35 p.m., Richard Renner died in front of a hotel on 49th Street. He was also stabbed. By 11 p.m., the killer was back on the subway looking for another victim. He spotted Carl Ramsey. In the dim light, no one noticed the knife. Bleeding severely, Ramsey crawled out of the subway. By midnight, he was dead. In less than 24 hours, 4 black men were dead. The New York City press dubbed the killer the Midtown Slasher. The rash of attacks on black men in Manhattan had many similarities to the profile of the .22 caliber killer. New York City investigators called on John Douglas to provide a profile of the slasher.
Because I did an independent analysis, and when I started to paint a portrait of that person, my goodness, it was just like the Buffalo, New York case as well. We have a subject here approaching his victims, blitz style of attack.
There was one major difference. The Midtown Slasher used a knife. The .22 caliber killer used a rifle.
Now, we don't have the 22 weapon, but maybe the reason for that is we don't have the 22 weapon because now we're dealing in areas that are very highly populated. If you have a 22 weapon, the sound of this would draw attention to himself.
Douglas determined that the signature behavior was identical. With a gun or a knife, the assailant attacked in the same way. By late December, District Attorney Cosgrove realized something else that bolstered the profiler's conclusion.
During that period of time, there had not been any assaults here in the city of Buffalo. It was quiet with respect to the activity of this .22 caliber assailant.
By the early weeks of 1981, the killer seemed to have disappeared. In January of 1981, the FBI and local investigators searched for the .22 caliber killer, wanted for the murders of at least 8 black men in New York City and Buffalo. Following months of investigation, Buffalo detective John Regan and his team were unable to come up with the name of a viable suspect.
The case is in limbo and everybody is frustrated. They don't know where to go. We don't have a name. We have no idea. Then out of the blue, there's a call made to the Buffalo Police Department homicide.
An officer from the Army's Criminal Investigative Division in Fort Benning, Georgia, made the call.
Interested in coming down and seeing what we have.
The Army was holding a 25-year-old Private Joseph Christopher on charges of assaulting a fellow soldier. On January 13th, 1981, Private Christopher attempted to stab an African-American enlistee. While he was in custody, Christopher tried to castrate himself with a razor. When Captain Dorothy Anderson began administering medical aid to the prisoner, he began muttering that he'd killed black men in the New York and Buffalo area. He didn't know the exact number of his victims. It was just something he had to do. Troubled by his story, Anderson reported it to the Army's Criminal Investigative Division. She told the CID officer of Christopher's ramblings. The CID officer remembered receiving an APB on the New York killings. He called the Buffalo Police Homicide Division as instructed by the teletype. For District Attorney Cosgrove, this explained why the killings had stopped in New York State.
From the time of our discovery of the second cab driver's gruesome death until almost Christmas of 1980, when we had the killings, the 4 killings in New York City, there had been a cessation of attacks, and apparently that was when Joseph Christopher was in the Army down in Georgia, as we later found out.
The FBI and the police finally had a name: Joseph Gerard Christopher. Agent Mrazowitz and his team compared Joseph Christopher's background to the .22 caliber killer profile.
He was pretty accurate. He described him as a white male, but early 30s, a loner. Possibly, if he were in the military, he would be hospitalized. He would be seeking psychiatric care. Prior to being in the military, he would have had menial-type labor. As soon as you had the name Joseph Gerard Christopher, you knew that that profile matched.
Investigators tracked down several friends and acquaintances of Christopher's.
Detective Loudman, talk to you a moment.
David Robinson had been a friend of the suspect for over a decade.
Familiar with a gentleman named Joseph Christopher?
They often shot target practice and went deer hunting together at Christopher's family cabin. He also told investigators that Christopher had a gun collection that his father had left him when he died. The collection included a .22 Ruger rifle, but Robinson never saw one that was cut down. Investigators secured a search warrant for Christopher's last known residence. They arrived at his mother's house in Buffalo, New York on April 22nd, 1981.
Looks like our boys are real neat housekeeping, huh?
In Christopher's bedroom, FBI agents recovered metal-rimmed glasses and khaki clothing that matched witness accounts of the perpetrator's apparel. The FBI profile drawn up by John Douglas predicted the .22 caliber killer would be fascinated by guns and the military. The Christopher basement was an underground firing range. Agents found the inherited gun collection and portions of a sawed-off gun barrel. Among the paraphernalia, forensic specialists found boxes of .22 ammunition, a misfired .22 caliber cartridge, along with a rotary magazine. Ballistics specialist Thomas Rowan believed the evidence was significant.
Finding the rotary magazine for the 1022 Ruger was an important feature that supported a widely held theory throughout the investigation that the shooter specifically picked something so he could keep the profile of the weapon low enough to fit inside of a paper bag when he conducted these executions of these men on the street.
The rotary magazine enabled Christopher to have a full load of ammunition and allowed the sawed-off weapon to remain concealed in a bag without having to reload. A second warrant allowed investigators to search the family cabin in Ellington, New York. Detectives dug in the spot where Robinson told them he and Christopher shot rifles. The excavation yielded 2 shells, marred with a unique firing pin mark. The same marking was on the shells collected at the crime scenes. Firearms specialists of the Erie County Department of Central Police Services examined the shell casings that were found at the Christopher home and cabin. They compared them to the casings found at the first 4 crime scenes. They concluded that the shells were all fired from the same gun. With this match, Assistant District Attorney John DeFranks was able to get an indictment from a grand jury.
The casings spoke for themselves. Put the casing under the microscope, you had your evidence. It couldn't be altered or tainted.
Joseph Christopher was extradited from Georgia and returned to Buffalo, New York to stand trial. Officers fitted Christopher with a ski mask to prevent witnesses from identifying him through the media.
We put a mask on him for purposes of preventing potential witnesses from observing his face on the television and then basing their identification on that rather than upon their own recollection.
All right, thank you, Ms. Gorney, for coming down.
One of those key witnesses was Madonna Gorney. She had seen the .22 caliber killer the first night he struck in the parking lot of the supermarket. On May 5th, 1981, she confronted Joseph Christopher in a lineup.
It was a little scary. I was concerned with the possibility of being actually anyone in the lineup being able to see us who were there to identify someone in the lineup.
Gorney was protected by the bright lights that shone in the eyes of the subjects. She was able to identify Christopher in 2 different lineups. Agents and local police felt certain that they had the .22 caliber killer. Questions of Christopher's mental competency delayed the trial. In December 1981, a judge pronounced Joseph Christopher mentally incompetent to stand trial. He was committed to the Mid-Hudson State Psychiatric Center where he received treatment. On February 17, 1982, Christopher was deemed fit for prosecution. The trial began on April 6, 1982. The community watched every step the prosecution took.
The media reported this entire case on a day-to-day basis, sometimes on a minute-by-minute basis. It was good for the community because they wanted answers, they wanted information. And it was good for us because it began to convince the community that we had the right individual and that their fears could be somewhat allayed.
The state jury found Joseph Christopher guilty for the murders of Glenn Dunn, Harold Green, and Emmanuel Thomas. He was sentenced to 60 years to life imprisonment. Prosecutors never tried him for the Manhattan knifings. One question still remained. Was Christopher also the taxicab slasher? Though the FBI profile excluded Christopher as the suspect, he later revealed details of the cab driver's wounds that only the killer could have known.
We wanted to make sure here in Buffalo and Erie County that we satisfied the community's need for professionalism, thoroughness, competence, and all the other things that the community expects of its policemen and prosecutors. And we were able to satisfy that need because we were successful.
Through science and good detective work, Joseph Christopher would never be free to kill again. He spent the rest of his life behind bars until his death, curiously from a rare form of male breast cancer at the age of 37.